Hi and welcome everyone. I'm Matthew, your librarian, specifically for the San Marcos campus, but usually I help most of the faculty across the different campuses. So yeah, I'd like to welcome you today to today's session on the Mindful Professor, Mindfulness in the Classroom. As I'm sure many of us can probably agree, the teaching and learning experience can be loaded with a variety of emotions and experiences, from a sense of satisfaction, achievement, and enjoyment, so also feelings of stress, anxiety, and being overwhelmed. And that can also affect not only the students, but I'm sure the instructor as well. Different parts of the process can really instigate different responses, especially when we're talking about whether it's the class lecture, discussion activities, reading the assigned materials, working on class assignments. And oftentimes, there could be a lot of different distractions that come about with our, just daily lives that can really affect how we really engage in the learning process and also the teaching process. And so hopefully this session is going to provide some insight on how we can apply contemplative pedagogy using everyday mindfulness practices and strategies that you can incorporate into your teaching. So yeah, this workshop kind of operates as a way of introducing you, especially if you don't practice mindfulness yourself. I was actually kind of curious in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, I wanted to ask, like, does anyone here actually practice mindfulness in their daily lives, just on a personal basis? Yeah, okay, I see some nods. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so, for me, I do as well, and it's only been recently that I've been really wanting to incorporate how I can really integrate mindfulness into my own instruction, especially as a librarian, but I wanted to also share how you can also do it as faculty. So yeah, that's kind of the purpose of this whole, workshop, is to really introduce mindfulness and more specifically the integration into contemplative pedagogy and applying those approaches and those strategies to really engage your students as another platform for deepening their learning experience, essentially. So one of the things before I got into the actual content of it, I figured it'd be nice to have a quick little mindful breathing exercise just to kind of center us before we kind of really engage in the actual learning materials. I kind of find if I have time, I usually like to apply this, especially even with students, because a lot of times they're coming right after class, especially for my workshops, or they're coming off of work, and they're still thinking about, those past activities. So it's a nice way of kind of settling in and being ready for some learning. So I'm going to play that just for effect. But yeah, so if you'd like to engage in this exercise, I definitely recommend situating yourself in whatever way is most comfortable to you. You can stand, you can sit, or lie on your back. We'll remain still and focusing on our breathing for just a couple minutes here. So you can start to breathe in slowly, in and out. Breathing in through your nose and then out through your mouth. Letting the breath enter and exit the body. As you breathe, allow yourself to let go of any lingering thoughts. Let go of the things you need to do later. Let go of the things you already did earlier today. Simply allowing your thoughts to float on their own, acknowledging them, letting them drift away as you gently focus on your breathing. As you continue to observe your breathing, noticing how it travels into your body, just being aware of how it feels, of how your body is reacting with each breath. If you notice your mind wandering at any point, or if you feel tension in your body, acknowledge it as you take in a breath and then release the tension, refocusing as you exhale. Feel free to take a moment as you kind of gently return to the session. I always find it a good way of kind of loosening those shoulders in particular, just kind of rolling them around, kind of loosening up that tension. Even though it's only 9 o'clock for me in the morning, I still can get kind of stressed trying to get into work and making sure this workshop was, kind of set up and ready to go. So, it's kind of nice to kind of loosen that, even for myself. Pause that and move on to what exactly is mindfulness? So yeah, I mean, basically that breathing exercise was kind of one example of how you can actually practice a sense of mindfulness. But really it comes with the question, what is mindfulness? What is the state that you're trying to reach when you're engaging in these exercises? And honestly, from the research and just from the literature just in general about mindfulness, it's kind of complex and kind of debating what exactly makes up or constitutes mindfulness. I give a little history here about how the word itself, mindfulness, was translated in 1881 into English for the first time, deriving from the word sati, which is basically the Buddhist practice of watching things, quote unquote, come to be and then, quote unquote, pass away. But yeah, even now, especially in Western science, as we gain a better understanding about the scientific value of mindfulness, there really isn't a consensus on the actual definition of mindfulness. It's often stemmed from being defined as earnest meditation. So it's more like a lot of scholars tend to focus more on the meditative part of mindfulness. Others talk about it as being going on autopilot would be another definition for it. So really there isn't a consistent or at least a generally agreed upon definition. But for our purposes here, I find that going by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who was actually the founder of the mindfulness stress reduction program, especially introducing it in a clinical context, probably provides the best example or kind of a working definition that we can readily apply for ourselves. In that he says, quote, it's the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding experience moment by moment. So yeah, it's particularly he focuses more on how it has more of an attentive type of dimension to it in terms of focus and clarity, as well as more importantly, the non-judgment part in terms of openness to experiences, both the experiences that you're having internally, but also the experiences that you are interacting with externally in whatever space you might be in. So for a classroom, that might be one of those spaces that we're talking about. And one of the other important things that Jon Kabat-Zinn really promotes is that anyone can practice mindfulness. And we're going to kind of go into that about that there are times when you might feel, or maybe your students feel, uncomfortable in certain types of scenarios or strategies of mindfulness that just don't work well for them. So really we're going to cover some strategies where It might engage other types of sensory processes, like mindful breathing, for example, kind of focuses more on visualization and more focusing on breathing. But there's other ones that I was going to cover as well that do auditory type of mindfulness, or even kinesthetic type of mindfulness, and even incorporating mindfulness into their own work, whether it's comprehending the readings, or actually synthesizing the evidence and actually creating projects or finishing up assignments. So we'll kind of go into that. But yeah, with contemplative pedagogy, that is essentially an extension of one area of mindfulness, specifically when it regards pedagogical approaches. It's the integration, as it kind of shows here, the integration of teaching and mindfulness to deepen the learning experiences with awareness, attention, and understanding, or in some cases, they often provide that as insight. And so, like we were kind of alluding to before, is that instructors and learners are, often overcome with a multitude of different distractions, demands on their time, anxieties when it regards to both teaching and to learning, and even multitasking is often kind of the pressure that they face, right? And often all those can really influence your own experience and your own takeaways from the whole experience. And so there's a variety of different challenges that we might encounter that can be readily addressed with contemplative pedagogical practices, including student distraction or anxiety, superficial learning, so maybe like surface level type of learning, rigid thinking, so it kind of actually does promote a little bit more reflexive and critical thinking as well. And then also the application of the readings. It could be course materials, and actually being able to incorporate those into their own daily lives and being able to understand and contextualize the importance of the readings or whatever lessons and content you're really wanting to impart to them. And also, the student motivation could also be more regarding about grades, trying to just get a good grade and pass the class, but at the sacrifice of actually wanting to learn, or at least in terms of engaging in the learning process. So they might be so motivated by the end result of the class that they're not necessarily taking in what they're engaging in and what they're navigating through in the learning process. So really, contemplative pedagogy focuses on several different principles, particularly, again, like focus and attention building, really enhancing what students can really attend to, what and how they're learning, as well as, again, a deeper connection to the course materials and to the course content in general, making it much more meaningful and relevant to themselves as they reflect upon it. And then also connections to others, and having a more empathetic relationship with their classmates and with also the instructor themselves. In particular, like I find it interesting with mindfulness that it often is painted as kind of like a very solitary experience, something that you just engage with yourself. But in a lot of ways, actually, we're going to talk about is how you can actually engage an entire classroom and have them all collectively engage in it together in different ways. And then also it promotes self-inquiry, personal meaning, and creativity. So oftentimes it does not only loosen the body and the tensions of there, but also the tensions within your mind, because again, like you might be coming into the classroom, after work or after some other type of task that you were trying to finish before you go to class, before you go to campus, or before you go into the Ring Central meeting. And again, there's like a whole bunch of different distractions that might be coming in. So those can really lock up, your openness to actually engage and to really create in the learning process. So mindfulness kind of helps you center around there and be able to be a little bit more flexible in that way. But yeah, and so with that, there's a bunch of different benefits also that comes with mindfulness. Again, kind of focusing on the principles we talked about. The research has actually shown there's a lot of promising effects on the physical and mental constitutions of people who actually engage in mindfulness, particularly because mindfulness can allow you to build stress buffering, resilience, and coping mechanisms, particularly because it allows you to be a lot more open to yourself and a little bit more acknowledging of your own stressors that are affecting you, and being able to acknowledge them and also to kind of in their own way let them go for the moment while you're engaged in something else, particularly a class. And it also helps to address, again, more depression, anxiety symptoms that might be, again, being prompted because you're ruminating on something else and not necessarily being in the moment. And then also cognitive abilities, because mindfulness is really not so much about clearing your mind or like quieting your mind in particular. It's about enhancing and training your mind to focus on something. So yeah, that's one of the important takeaways from mindfulness. And before I really get into the actual strategies here, it'll be actually the next step after this, but really about how to plan out your contemplative practice. Again, the goal is not to quiet the minds of students so they only focus on you, but really it's about having them be able to pay attention without judgment, being able to be open to the whole experience, to really engage in it and allow themselves to really immerse themselves in it without necessarily the external distractions or even internal distractions that they're facing. One of the other lessons I kind of do talk about is that this contemplative pedagogy doesn't necessarily mean that it has to wrap around your entire teaching philosophy. It doesn't have to incorporate into every element of your class experience. Really, you can adapt small changes to your classroom. So as we talk about certain strategies, you can easily just make some small changes just to see how it kind of works with your students and see what kind of impact it has. Another important thing is to be intentional and transparent with students so they understand the purpose of this practice and how it relates to their learning. And in this case, I'm really talking about like articulating the purpose to your students so they are open to participating in the practice. Because otherwise, if you don't really give them a whole lot of preparation in terms of what they're going to be engaging in, they may not be as readily making themselves accessible to it. And also contextualizing it in the course so that the students understand how it is affecting their learning. And another thing too is that you do want to make it a voluntary process. Provide an opportunity for your students to opt out during any practice and maybe complete a different activity, an alternate activity that you would like them to do instead. Mainly because mindfulness can, for some students or even just some individuals in general, kind of promote, it almost enhances their anxiety because they're really focusing on themselves in a way, right? So, as a result, they might, feel a little bit more vulnerable than they actually did before the exercise. So, it's totally okay to let them just, again, engage in a different activity or just to opt out of it completely. It's, and really that's what mindfulness is about. It's not really enhancing the anxiety. It's about addressing it. So, yeah, so that would be one of the things to consider. Another thing too is you can set a time limit, like even with the mindful breathing exercise that we kind of just did. I really just set it for like a couple minutes, and that just kind of worked for the process here. But time allowing, you may want to go a little bit deeper into it. There's other types of mindful breathing exercises like the body scan, which is a little bit more in depth about like covering different parts of your body, right? But again, you don't have to necessarily commit like a full 45 minutes to a mindfulness session. And I think that's often a misconception, especially with meditation, because a lot of it is so focused on meditation that you might think, I don't have time to, have my students go through a 45-minute meditation when I really have only 45 minutes to do a presentation or some type of lecture or some type of discussion. So again, you can really just spend as little as 1 minute to as many minutes as you can spare that you think is appropriate. And also, I think it's important to allow students time after the exercise to really reflect on and even if you want to, have them write about their experience or discuss it with each other. So yeah. Just before I go forward, is there any particular questions I can kind of address when it comes to contemplative pedagogy or just mindfulness in general? Feel free to unmute yourself or in the chat. That's totally fine as well. But just want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page there.
We did guided relaxation
Mhm.
during psych class,
Oh,
and it was wonderful. Like the students adored it. Took maybe 10 minutes maximum, and they're like, can we do this every week? And it's like, well, we got some other things on the agenda, but we did do it one more time during that term because they absolutely adored it.
yeah, totally. No, that's awesome to hear, and really that kind of illustrates too is like you don't necessarily have to do it every class, but like anytime you have a spare moment to do so, yeah, and yeah, it only had to take 10 minutes, and it does have that like immediate impact almost for a lot of students. So that's really encouraging to hear.
For me too, when I was in OT school, I think it was in psych class, but that was the first time really mindfulness had been brought into my vocabulary.
Mhm.
And I still vividly to this day remember the exact path on my way to my dorm room where I really like saw the flowers, saw the butterflies in the beautiful springtime. You know, there's elements, of course, of OT school that I don't remember, but I remember that particular moment when mindfulness was, I was able to practice it. So
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's awesome to hear. And yeah, again, it kind of makes that kind of meaningful connection to where you actually do remember it and kind of take away from it, in terms of other experiences that might have been like, no, I'm going to shut those out, but that was such a, yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. And again, it's really just making like small changes. You don't really have to make like huge initiatives to really like say, no, my entire lesson is going to be about contemplative pedagogy. It can be just making those small changes because yeah, it does make that kind of impact. You can see just what exactly makes them more open to it or more engaging with it as well. So it's a nice way to kind of experiment with it.
Matthew, we also, when we did it
Mhm.
that day, the first time in psych class, right after that, our agenda was to talk about the Kawa model.
Oh,
So it really went well with, okay, so let's focus on what some of the obstacles were that you discovered in your contemplative time.
nice. Yeah. And yeah, yeah, that's awesome. But yeah, yeah, and also like, yeah, kind of actually what you just illustrated, you can either do it right before a discussion, you can do it right after, or, maybe you have a really intense discussion, but you didn't really have a moment to really reflect on it. So that might give you a moment to really like take some quiet time just to kind of think about it and really think about what you took away from it. So no, that's great. It's a great primer in that way too. Let's see. So I'm going to move on. So this is where I'm actually going to cover some other types of activities. We just discussed a couple different, instances where you can really apply mindfulness, particularly with like guided type of meditations and such. But one of the ones I actually like to talk about is contemplative reading. And the last time I did this workshop with faculty, they seemed to really gravitate towards this particular idea, mainly because it related back to instances with journal clubs and also just comprehension of the reading, if it in a classroom setting. So yeah, the reading, like contemplative reading, can be really great when you have to have them participate or really to immerse themselves in a difficult text. Like most of the textbooks, especially in a clinical setting, are pretty complex, and they have a lot of jargon going on. So you're really having to grapple with a bunch of different types of concepts and words and terminology and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it makes it really understandable that especially when students are probably like maybe they're more motivated to just pass through the course, or pass through a test in particular. They're really just wanting to memorize it really quickly, regurgitate it, and then it's almost kind of like they kind of leave it as soon as the class ends, right? So there might be a little bit of a surface level type of thing where they're having a hard time remembering what they read, or they didn't see the relevance in the course readings later on. And I find that contemplative reading kind of allows for a moment for students to really engage and improve their understanding of a text, and almost bring almost a sense of enjoyment and awareness to the act of reading. Because sometimes it can also be like reading can be almost seen as a chore. Like it's like, okay, I have to read like so many pages, and then I can finally move on to something I actually enjoy about the class. But you can almost make this almost an enjoyable practice within it. So in particular, one of the things I wanted to suggest was almost creating a reading circle. And that's actually been one of the practices within contemplative reading methodology, is having students in a classroom. It can even be virtual too. Like, so this could readily be applied not only inside a physical classroom, but also virtually, where you can have like one student read a passage or a sentence of the text out loud. And then, maybe spend a moment of just quiet reflection, have everyone kind of focus on that, particularly if it's like a sentence or a definition within the text that's particularly hard, or that students are having a harder time trying to grapple with. After they have a moment to kind of reflect on it, you can open up a discussion about it, which I think is also another thing that I think it kind of opens up for students. Is like, usually when you're kind of like addressing a certain concept and then you immediately want to open up to a discussion about it, sometimes you kind of hear crickets because students are like, still like either unsure about their own thoughts about the particular subject, or they're kind of a little wary about like, oh, I don't want to get the wrong answer kind of thing. So I think having a quiet moment to reflect beforehand, so they can really think about the text, allows them to kind of engage in the discussion a little bit more. And then once you're kind of done with that particular sentence or passage, you can have the next student kind of take on another passage or another sentence, and just keep repeating that, almost in a circular pattern. And it might really help to enhance that discussion activity, whatever you might have in that sense. And again, to counteract that urge to rush through a reading assignment, because I think that might happen quite a bit. At least I get that from students, especially when I'm teaching like library instruction and stuff. They'll want to breeze through everything. And then when we actually get to the activity, they're all, I actually don't know how to do this, because like, even though they read it, they didn't necessarily comprehend it. So, that could be another great way of really engaging them, and also making it, again, a much more collective process, because I think it also helps to acknowledge that everyone's kind of having that kind of vulnerability of their own understanding of the text. So having that moment to reflect and have that moment to discuss makes it a much more collective effort, rather than just like, I'm reading it on my own, and now I'm going to be judged for my own individual interpretation of the text or my own individual understanding of it. But I think having it as a reading circle format kind of engages and provides that kind of buffer, that it's not just me, and like the focus is not just on me, kind of thing. So but yeah, any particular thoughts or any questions about the reading circle or contemplative reading just in general? Let's see. Go. But yeah, let's see. Yeah, mindful listening. So this is one of my favorite mindful exercises to do. It's very similar to the mindful breathing. So what I was kind of alluding to is that there are other types of ways engaging students through their sensory processing, particularly beyond just visualization and such, because maybe students are much more, your students are much more prone to do auditory type of learning, like they listen instead. They really want to focus on that aspect. Or maybe there's some students that have a harder time doing active listening skills, or just listening in general. So you really want to kind of help build those type of skill sets. Especially like in particular, what I'm going to allude to with mindful listening is that it also helps to not only practice focusing or active listening, but also empathetic listening, particularly when you're talking about like clinical settings and clinical topics in general. They can be very emotionally provoking. They can be very controversial in some aspects, or just prompt different types of feelings or other types of sensations that might not be necessarily pleasant for some students. So this is a really great way for students to actually be able to become a much more mindful listener, to be able to be open to the experience of whatever they're listening to. And so yeah, I'm going to try to engage in a little bit of an exercise for that right here. So let me play this first. So one of the things you can really do when you're doing a mindful listening exercise is to use music. Because I'm sure most of us kind of listen to music when we're either working on a project of some sort, or we use it to relax afterwards, anything of that kind of sort. So music often has that kind of like therapeutic effect in some cases. And so mindful listening can be exercised using music. So I'm going to play a song in a moment. But really, you can play any type of music. I actually, personally, I use metal music, which doesn't seem like it would be the most mindful type of music to use. But for some reason, it works for me. But it honestly kind of depends on your own, personal taste. But really, one of the things with mindful listening is that you can also apply this to any music, even stuff you don't necessarily like, personally. Maybe it's something that you're just not really like into it on a normal basis. But because it's something you don't necessarily like, it allows you like to be much more open to it, to really process it and really to immerse yourself in it in a much more accepting and open manner. And again, it's kind of related to, listening to topics that you may not be comfortable with. And so you can kind of readily apply that similar type of analogy, I guess. But yeah, let me play a thing and yeah. And then we'll kind of engage in a little bit of an exercise with it. It'll be very similar to the mindful breathing. Let's see. So I'm going to play the music there. Let me know if it's too loud or anything like that. I tried to measure it for my voice so you can actually still hear me. But so if you notice that it's not as useful, let me know. So yeah, as the song plays, gently close your eyes. Or if you'd like, again, you can focus on the moving turntable right there that's shown on the screen. As you listen to the song, let go of any thoughts or judgments that you might have about the genre of the music, perhaps the vocals that you might hear, or if you happen to recognize the title or the artist of the song, you can readily let those go as well. Just allowing your mind to absorb the sounds traveling through the ear. Even if you initially dislike the music or may not necessarily be warming up to it, it's just important to give yourself permission to become fully aware of the song, the beats and the rhythm, allowing your mind to respond to the sounds. Gently notice the different instruments being used to create a sound. You may wish to explore each instrument separately, discovering the unique sound that it is working to create. You don't necessarily need to think about the music. You only need to hear it. And I'll give a moment for all of us to kind of gently come back and return to the session. And I'll probably lower down the music. Let's see, there we go. Any thoughts or any immediate kind of experiences that you might have had? Yeah, okay, I see a thumbs up. Great. Yeah, I really personally like this one. I typically do it a lot on my own personal time, but when I can, I try to incorporate into my instruction whenever it's kind of probably most appropriate, especially when, again, it might be about a difficult topic that they're wanting to explore or that we're kind of like wanting to explore together. And I feel like this is a really great way of kind of, again, loosening up those tensions that might be being prompted because of that. And especially to just be much more open to the whole experience, and and almost acknowledge your own discomfort, and so that way you can maybe reflect on it later, like, why did I feel like that? Why did I tense up like that? Because a lot of times, especially when we're feeling tense about a topic, we may not even necessarily recognize that we're like, our body's like kind of stiff or might be tense in some way. So I think it's a nice way of kind of loosening up about that, but also just acknowledging it for later reflection. So let's see. So I'll move on to another activity that I really like, and it's also kind of a parallel to the contemplative reading strategies that I was kind of talking about. And this is contemplative writing. So much like with the contemplative reading, where that was more addressing the surface level kind of understanding of a text, or maybe not necessarily having the right, or it's not necessarily right, it's having the best type of approach to a course material when it comes to either being just more motivated to go through it and memorize it as much as possible, and then pass a test or something like that. Contemplative writing kind of helps to address some really common challenges that students might face when it comes to writer's block or to procrastination. Maybe they decide to wait until the very the day of, or even the night of, to finish up a class assignment that requires some type of writing component. And again, it might be that they might be more motivated to just pass with a passing grade, rather than actually being motivated to learn and actually engage in the writing assignment as another key component of their own learning. And then also being able to, again, to be able to reflect on how class experiences, in particular course materials that they might be having to synthesize in the writing, to their everyday lives. And I think that can be another thing that might blocks students from being able to really engage in the writing. It probably is going to inform their writer's block. It's like they just have a hard time meaningfully connecting it in their own unique perspective. But yeah, there's a couple different activities that I like to promote. I have a couple here in particular. I know I have where students can actually journal their experiences, and particularly I gave a couple of different examples of like field work or simulation or learning materials and so much more. Kind of depends on the nature of your class and what it actually requires, but I feel like that's another great way of having them be able to reflect, gives them another moment to really think about their own feelings and also their own thoughts as they were engaging in the field work, or maybe the simulation, or again, learning materials. Both the positives that they got out of it, but also kind of also acknowledging the negatives, like in particular, like why did I have a hard time grappling with a particular concept, or maybe I was having a hard time with a certain process in the field work, or anything like that. And in that way, they can keep those notes for themselves and be able to really reflect on it and also apply it later on, so they can actually work on it. So it kind of allows them to really address, some the boundaries of them of their own comfort, basically, in the learning process. I also have where I even talk about, like, kind of like what we were talking about with guided meditations, is that you can readily apply this before or during or after a course component within the class, whether it's about a discussion, so you can do it like right before a discussion, so they can really think about before they actually engage in the discussion itself. Again, almost like a reading circle, you can easily integrate this into a reading circle where, in addition to their moment of reflection, they can write down some thoughts that they had. And then also be able to kind of clarify it later on in the discussion. That way, yeah, you don't have to adjust like any crickets, because again, they're still trying to process it in the moment of the discussion. This kind of gives them a moment to really prime themselves for it. And then, yeah, another thing I really like to incorporate into my teaching is also writing, doing free writing. So having them write continuously without stopping to fix grammar or spelling, or having to correct their thoughts in some way. Just let them do a free flow. of writing for, a predetermined amount of time. You can give them, 5 minutes, you can give them 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, again, is appropriate for that particular class session or your just overall lesson plan. And then, one of the things I do recommend, especially with free writing, because oftentimes, again, like kind of like the discussion where you just kind of open up with it and then, it's kind of like they're still having to generate those thoughts, is I like to have a specific prompt or a specific question for them to guide their writing in some way. It could be really general about like, when I read, this particular text, or when I did this particular simulation, I thought, dot, dot, dot. And so they can kind of go with that. Or asking them to incorporate a specific word. Maybe you really want them to delve into a specific concept or a specific terminology and really to explore their thoughts on it, how they're trying to, again, comprehend it. Those are a couple different ways that you can really help to integrate contemplative writing. I also find it like a really useful way if you wanted to make it more where you can actually, let me think of what I'm trying to say here. If you wanted to actually collect the writings from students, but in an anonymous way, because I would probably recommend doing it anonymous to where they don't feel like they're going to get judged for whatever they wrote. That would be an important step in the process. But you can, like in that way, you can easily like designate a student to collect all the papers and then give it to you. That way you can't really actually recognize who actually wrote what. So that way they don't feel like they're being judged about, like, based on like their handwriting, you're going to suddenly recognize that that's that particular student or anything like that. You can easily use that as almost an assessment of like how they really grappled with a particular part of your course or class session, that particular topic. It's a great way of kind of assessing for that, and then you can easily address that in the next class, like say, hey, I actually did notice that there was a general consensus that there was a hard time, or there was an interesting interpretation of so and so of whatever the concept was, and really kind of use that as almost another discussion prompt later on for another class. I feel like that's another great way, but you can easily just make it a more of a private reflection for them, so they can keep it for themselves and keep those notes to work on for future classes or future class sessions. I did see a comment actually that seemed really interesting from Tiffany. Narrative medicine is the study of patient and clinician experiences through storytelling in medical humanities. When you studied narrative medicine, you explored a lot of different media styles like movies, music, written and read poetry, journaling, and going to art museums. Awesome. Some studies suggest that engaging in narrative medicine can have a lasting impact on scores of empathy in clinic and vulnerable patient encounters. Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, again, it doesn't have to necessarily be even contemplative writing. As Tiffany kind of illustrated, you can easily use this in more like types of media or types of other forms of it. Poetry would be another example. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just like a first-person journaling type of thing. It could be also like they want to express themselves in poetry or music or anything like that. That might work for them, which would actually kind of make some interesting class projects in that sense, some multimedia type of stuff. And actually, one of the things I actually am doing a little bit more in my own thing is doing a workshop on zine making. So I have them actually make zines, and so they can actually kind of reflect on their own personal experiences, whatever the prompt may be, or there might be their own personal prompt of what they want to explore, but having that also that multimedia kind of stance on it. So it's kind of a nice way of incorporating that. So yeah, awesome. Any other thoughts or any questions about this in particular?
This is fantastic, Matthew.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I'm loving that everyone's like sharing some ideas and getting really inspired, or sharing their own experiences of how they've been incorporating very similar types of strategies and approaches. So it's awesome. Thank you so much.
And I love that you too, like we talk about superficial learning versus deep learning. And anytime I reflect on like moments of deep learning for me, it's been a highly emotional experience. Like I
Yeah.
feel like I connect not only the information and how it applies clinically into other people, but how like I feel about it and
Mhm.
how I can envision myself participating in it. So I think that these contemplative, really reflective strategies, that's what helps carry that information over and maybe
Yeah.
make our students more able to explain it to a patient or a
Mhm.
client or explain it to other classmates who might be confused. I know at least when I studied narrative medicine, I half the time after class, I like felt like I needed to go tell somebody about this like treasure trove of something that I found. And I think that like we talk about the difference between, you know, education in the past and
Mhm.
education now and how student learning needs are different. And I think that lighting that fire and that flame of like passion for learning,
Mhm.
I think that this is a great tool to do that. So
Definitely. No, I totally agree. And actually, like the fact that you were talking about like, the clinician explaining something to a patient who may not necessarily know, like in the same way, like, I mean, a student's actually learning it for the first time too. So now, like when they have that moment to reflect on it, they know how they felt when they first learned it and, all those feelings that they were having. So they can readily be much more empathetic to their patient who's having that very same experience in their own way. And in a lot of ways can be a lot more real for them because it may be about their health and stuff like that. So they can be much more, empathetic and much more compassionate in that regard. So yeah, definitely. So it builds on those soft skills as well, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, I think I have one more strategy. And luckily, it works out since we have a few more minutes. But I won't go too much. I won't have us do a full exercise on this because it may depend on your own setting right now. But yeah, I do want to address like mindful movements. So like I was alluding to, there's a lot of different ways you can engage students sensorily. And in particular, I find that mindful movement is a really great kinesthetic approach because there might be students who feel really anxious when you're kind of asked to sit or to stand very still for a few minutes even. I know I used to until I finally got a little bit more comfortable with how I was like situating myself. But for some students and even for some instructors, it might be better just to kind of move around. And so mindful movement might be a really good exercise and a technique that you want to incorporate. Because you might even notice, and I can really attest to this as well for my own personal sake, is that your mind might become a little bit clearer when you're moving around or doing a walk. It allows you to become a little bit more distracted in a way, but in a way that kind of you're just accepting everything that's kind of coming around you. Like in terms of walking through nature or walking through a museum, actually, you're kind of just taking in everything around you. And it kind of almost like feels like you're on autopilot, but it's not that you're necessarily not there. It's just that you're being present. You're just being in the moment and not necessarily doing any type of deep thinking until much later, probably. And oftentimes maybe we often get a lot of good ideas and we kind of take note of those and then think about them later on and do an intensive development of those ideas. So I often do that. I'll somehow get that light bulb experience where I'm just like, that was the idea I need to work on. And I got it through walking rather than through intensively, taking notes and something like that, right? So really for your students, if you ever want to try to incorporate this, I mean, you can even do this virtually, kind of depends again, again, some students may not be able to actually move around their space for whatever reason. But you can easily have them just kind of like get up, kind of stretch a little bit and having them, take some deliberate steps, just, even like some short steps around where they were originally seated. Or they can walk around their house a little bit. Maybe you can have them like, just turn up their audio so they can still hear you. And just walking at a pace that's most natural or comfortable to them. And just have them, sometimes it can work where you can have them like count their steps and it makes it a little bit more deliberate in that sense because they're actually deliberately having to take note of each and every step. And, just having them really pay attention to their movement, how their whole body is like shifting and reacting. And again, it kind of allows you to really focus on something because again, instead of focusing on your breathing in this case, it's really focusing on your steps or any type of movement that you're making. So really, when I'm talking, this is why I kept it general as mindful movement, is that you can easily, it doesn't have to necessarily be about walking. It could just be some simple exercise that you're having them do in terms of like, loosening up their shoulders, or, kinking their neck a little bit, just like stretching it a little bit. So it could easily be more like stretches and all that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, this could readily be applied not only inside a home, and like if you're doing like a virtual learning experience, or if it's in a classroom, you can have everyone kind of do it together in some way if it kind of works within the space. Or if you have even time, you can even do it outside, like off of campus or anything like that. Depends on the, kind of works out for your particular class session. And then, as they're kind of doing that, you can easily guide them to, really become aware of the environment around them, just asking them questions about how do your feet feel? How does the air kind of feel around you? Is there any like smells? Is there any sights, like visual stuff that they're seeing, like other people or other types of things around them? Colors, objects, stuff like that. Just really noticing those sensations, but much like with mindful breathing and with mindful listening, not necessarily putting labels or names on those things that they're seeing or that they're kind of experiencing. Just acknowledging them, letting them go, and just continue focusing on their movements. And again, this could easily be, take only a few minutes, could take a little longer if you want to. But yeah, I feel like it's another nice way of like being able to accommodate for students who might be much more engaged by like much more movement-based type of stuff, which I'm sure with physical therapy and even occupational therapy and every other health sciences discipline, movement is a really integral part, right, of that whole clinical experience. So why wouldn't it be in the teaching and learning experience as well? So I find it's another really great tip for that as well. I think we should make Matthew an honorary OT. Okay. Awesome. I'll take that. But yeah.
You're speaking our language right now.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, and even from when I'm doing like a mindful session with students, like I'll do something like this where I'm actually engaging them in certain sessions. I'll talk about it in that way, so it kind of makes it a little bit more meaningful for them, because yeah, I'm trying to curate it in a way that actually makes sense to them, and then that they can readily apply in their own clinical, professional, and educational experiences. So hopefully that's accomplishing that end. But yeah, so I think I'm pretty much at the end of my thing, but I'll move on to, there we go. Perfect.
Some of these practices can't, you mentioned field work, and Nichelle and I are both AFWCs, but some of these practices the students could use with their clients.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I totally see that as well, because I mean, your patients are also experiencing a lot of anxiety or a lot of different feelings, especially as they're learning about, the diagnosis or about the treatment options or anything like that, especially as you're walking them through. So yeah, totally. I could see this being in the patient practitioner encounter for sure. It can definitely inform them and be able to really engage them in that sense too. Yeah. And allow them also that contemplation, that moment of reflection is too, because yeah, a lot of thoughts are probably going through, and so it allows them to help sift and sort through them in a much more deliberate manner, rather than feeling rushed and having to incorporate a bunch of information that's probably going through them. Because yeah, as we discussed, those concepts can be very complex too.
And if the student has a field work in a school-based setting, and they're working with kids that have autism, how wonderful to help those students become more self-regulated.
Definitely. Yeah.
And the teachers will love them.
Oh yeah, I'm sure, right? So yeah, again, it's building on those like really like soft service skills too. So yeah, you're building on those. And even for me, like I actually, like you made me think about how I actually apply mindfulness practices when I'm talking about cognitive biases, especially when it talks about like, well, as a librarian, I talk about more of the literature search, but that could readily apply in terms of their own look for evidence to really inform their own clinical experiences and their own clinical services to patients, especially because they're trying to, again, being that evidence-based practitioner, right? So, and there's a lot of actual cognitive biases that actually influence how you search for information. So I talk about that and how you can actually address those using mindfulness and self-care practices. So actually, another way in terms of how it addresses in a professional context, for sure.
I like too how at least at the last hospital that I worked at, it was a large medical group, and they started a research study. There was a physiatrist that was part of our PM&R department, and she started a research study where just tweaking the language of our EMR, our medical record system, it would pop up a window for non-invasive pain management strategies. So a lot of these like mindfulness and kind of mindful movements principles, and it would encourage nurses, it would encourage therapists to engage in these practices, or even just ask the question if the patient would be willing to engage in them. Because certainly, there are some that it's a super invaluable resource for them and they're just committed and they think it's just better than sliced bread, right? But then there's others who think that you're a kook. And it's like, I'm thinking like the old farmer types that are just like, give me the Tylenol, So I think that even just changing the language of the systems that we work in, that can have a really profound impact on whether or not it's even brought up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And even for me, like, I feel like a lot of the times, kind of like what you're saying, like kind of almost that resistance that can kind of sometimes happen is that can really be applied to mindfulness too. Cause like, even when you talk to someone about mindfulness, they kind of be all like, because they have a certain conception of how that actually works. But really a lot of these like practices here, you don't even have to call it mindfulness in a lot of ways. Like you just go into them and like, and incorporate them into daily activities or daily, just interactions that you're having. So, don't have to necessarily call it that, but whether they know it or not, they can easily engage in it. So, totally.